And I want to ask you first, how did you get into this area? What drew you into this area?
That's a great question. Actually, since I was a little girl, I used to beg my parents to adopt, and I wanted a bigger brother. And they were like, "We don't know how to do that." And I'm like, "I think you just adopt." and they were like, "That's not something we're going to do, but you can do that." So I always knew, actually, since I was a little kid, that I wanted to adopt. And then when I went to school as a social worker, and began working in child welfare from the beginning of my career. And on my first date with my husband, I said, "Just so you know, I'm going to adopt. Is that something you're okay with?" And he was like, "Do I have to tell you right now?" Or
First date.
yes,
Wow.
first date. I was very serious.
And when you were really young, you knew you were going to adopt?
Yeah, at the time I couldn't have verbalized, but looking back, my best friend growing up was adopted.
Oh, okay.
And so I saw that story play out for her and her family. And so I think that's where that came from. But at the time, I couldn't have verbalized that.
Was it a positive story for her?
It was, yep. And we're still close to this day. So, yeah.
Wow. I know my daughter, who's adopted, has always said, "Mum, I'm adopting." I said, "Well, darling, that's great." And I said, "You might want to have kids, you might want to adopt kids," but she's very sure she wants to adopt too.
Oh, I love that.
So you started into social work, and did you primarily work with vulnerable children? Was that your main area?
Yeah, so I started out in the hospital. So any child abuse case that
Oh,
came into Children's Hospital was my case. And so that's kind of where I got my start.
that
Um,
must have, what a place to start. How was that on you? I mean, I'm always fascinated how people who are right on the front line, as Dr. Karen Purvis was, how you keep yourself on an equilibrium to handle the emotional impact it has. To me, there's nothing worse than seeing a vulnerable child. It just, I
I
can't
agree.
take it.
Yeah, I think there's something that rises up in me that isn't me, frankly. That that's like this kid has to have a voice, and if not me, then who right now in this moment? And so that kind of drove me early when I was young in my career, of being a voice for the voiceless and seeking justice for them and really helping to empower families from the jump.
How was it for you when you see a child who's been abused? How do you then holistically handle their healing with the parents who are probably the abusers? So you obviously have to work with them as well and understand their circumstance.
Honestly, Deb, that's my favorite part of my job, is because I've never met a parent who doesn't want to be a good parent.
Yes.
I truly haven't. And I really believe that we're all doing the best that we can with what we know and in our current circumstances. And not to say that there aren't crazy people out there, but it's so, so, so few. Most of the parents that I've worked with in my career are desperately trying to do at least better than our parents did, right? Like that's like where all of our bars are. So with that in mind, for me, it's really just empowering parents through their own journeys of healing and growth.
Because it's usually when parents are struggling, I always take it back to they're suffering their own trauma, and they've probably been victims of abuse themselves. And it's this, I'm very fascinated by epigenetics. It's this
Yes.
generational thing that just keeps repeating itself over and over. And we've got to have the tools, which is why I love Karen's work. We've got to have the tools of how to stop the cycle and how to support these kids. To me, like, working in the adoption area in Australia, I always say, to do ethical adoption, there has to be in place this sort of work to have healing, because these children, no matter what child is relinquished, abandoned for whatever circumstance, there is a trauma attached to that, and therefore they need to be supported ongoing. The parents, adoptive parents, need to have the tools of how to handle a child that's been traumatized. And quite frankly, all the educators and teachers need to have access, because a lot of times in the schools, these teachers just go, "This is a really naughty kid." No, this is a child in pain. We only behave badly when we're hurting. So I would love to see it part of the education system, that teachers are trained in something like TBRI to be able to flag and recognize when a child is struggling, and recognize if there is, trouble at home, that, you can see from the behavioral stuff, which is what you would recognize very easily doing the work that you do.
And that's truly the hope of my job, is watching the cycle end. I would say, like, that is the joy of what I do. Yes, there are those hard moments. But for me, you're exactly right, Deb. That cycle will not stop until we empower parents to understand trauma, to understand attachment, and to understand that there's hope in those things, that there's healing. And that's the gift of TBRI, that for me as a professional, but also as an adoptive parent, has been such a gift to not, I think there's like this new thing out there, like you talked about, like in education, and, where, we have to be trauma informed. We have to be trauma informed.
Yeah.
Well, understanding that trauma has changed a child isn't enough. We then have to know what to do about it, right? And how do we help heal it? And so that's that gift that I believe that the Karen Purvis Institute has, and that we love to hand to communities and say, we can stop this. We can stop this cycle.
And it's not, and what I found in the work, it's not just for this community, for the adoptive community. All of us on some level have trauma. So it applies to us all as parents. The greatest teacher I remember Karen Purvis gave to me, and I always say this, and people are sort of, like adoptive parents or just, biological parents, that she used to do the time in and not the time out. Because my little boy was always quite behavioral. I was always giving him a timeout. But when you think about it, when you give a child a timeout, you're shunning them, you're pushing them away. For a child who's always already feeling abandoned, so you're pushing them away, and then what happens? They feel shame. And then when you feel shame, what happens? The bad behavior continues. And just that simple thing of having a time in, come and sit with me, sit by my side, think about what you did, and give them time, which is what's more annoying than sitting with your mother and thinking about what you just did. And then at the end of it, you go, okay, how could you have handled that better? And they come up with a solution so they feel good about themselves. And at the end of that lesson, you can high five them and say, good job, great, on your way. But that simple thing, it just made so much sense to me. And this is part of the work that she does. And I remember, my favorite lines of hers, she always said, oh, darling, the more behavioral the child, the more tender-hearted. Like, she recognized that. She had such empathy, and she had to deal with some pretty severe cases of delinquent kids. And it always amazed me, this sort of very elegant Southern belle who could just whip them into shape, with just a look and a few words. And she just got it. She just understood it. And I love that her legacy lives on. I guess she came to Australia several times and spoke to us down there, and we still, give out her DVDs, and I try and implement her work at TBRI, because I think internationally this is the most needed work.
Yeah, you're right. And there's so many things about the simple idea that you spoke of the time in, that once we understand like brain development and regulation, right, we know that kids need something called a co-regulator, where they don't have the ability to regulate their own emotions and behaviors. Initially, that's a learned behavior from a safe adult. And so by bringing them in, their bodies literally are regulating to our bodies, just like when you hold a baby, right? And they stop crying, then their heart rate regulates to our heart rate. It's the same with our older kids. And so by bringing a child close, not only are we stopping that message of you don't belong and, shame and those types of things, but we're also literally teaching their brains and bodies how to regulate by bringing them in close. And then I always remind people, like, what we do with our kids when they're little, what we teach them, they do it when they're big. Yeah. So one of the things with teenagers, right, when they've had a bad day, oftentimes we know because they go right to their room and close the door, right? But when they were little and they were upset and had big emotions, did we send them to their room?
No, they came to mommy.
Right. So that's that thing. Like if we can teach them when they're little, come to me, right? With big emotions, with big feelings, even if it's
And
not.
they'll continue to do that. I
Yeah.
get a bit of both. I get the closed door and I get the come.
Yeah. Well, and you
It's the teenager thing. Yeah.
yes. And part of that is healthy, right? Like I'm becoming an adult. I need to learn how to do this myself. But we always want the message to be with our kids, right? Like I'm a safe place. And
Yeah.
so if I was safe when you were little for big emotions, and I didn't say go to your room, right? But I said, come, let me help. Then when they're big, they'll remember that message. And that's the hope in so much of this is that we can help to wire their brains for connection. And we know that through connection, we see healing and proper brain development.
That was Karen always talked about that felt safety, right? Felt safety. It's a very different thing. And because so many of these kids never felt safe,
right,
that they have to learn it. And that's a journey.
Yeah.
Have you seen, like, during the pandemic, have you seen a rise in domestic violence or kids in vulnerable situations? I mean, I know there's been a rise in domestic violence because of the pandemic. So how is that? How does the Purvis Institute implement, say, support for these kids? Does the government continue? I mean, it's not a job you can go 9 to 5. You've got to be there 24/7 in situations like this. Do you get sent out to homes, or how do you affect, having an input to these kids' lives?
Yeah. So we know that nationally we've seen domestic violence rise, and we've actually seen overall cases of child abuse decrease. But the reason that is because kids aren't around those safe adults like they normally would be, for example, in a school or in a church setting or in it, right? So those mandatory reporters that would normally be reporting things like child abuse don't have access to the children. So I would say that our current numbers don't necessarily, and I would venture to say absolutely don't, give us a full picture of what's going on. And I would probably bet that we won't truly understand the impact of this pandemic for years to come. But we can only assume that kids who don't feel safe at home and who don't have safe homes are struggling in extreme ways. At the KPICD, the way that we help support those kids is just like you mentioned earlier, Deb, through those systems. So we work really diligently with communities, and we believe that any system that's touching the life of a child, that they need TBRI and they need to understand these skills. So we work with schools, we work with court systems and juvenile justice systems, we work with churches, we work with any faith, right? And we help those institutions who are touching the lives of children to understand trauma, to understand how it changes the brain, the body, the behavior, the belief system of children, and then what to do about it. And so we help to get to those children through those systems because there's just a small band of us. So, yeah.
But you're training up. Are you expanding? Are you training up people? Are there more people that want to get into this area of work?
Yeah. So we have a training for practitioners, which is our training for professionals who are wanting to use TBRI in their profession. So we have that training. It used to be 4 times a year. This year we'll have 10. And those are always, we'll have hundreds and hundreds of
hours.
hours.
Zoom training sessions.
Yeah. So
that's going to be tricky because it's hard. That's such an in-person.
Yes. Yeah. We did them last year. Yeah. We did them last year through Zoom, and then this year, some of them, but now we also have them internationally. So this year
great.
Yeah. And we have countries from across the globe. So for example, the country of Colombia is deeply implementing TBRI in their child welfare systems right now. So we'll have a practitioner training for Colombia that'll be in Spanish and are for their professionals in the country of Colombia. We'll also have one for the country of Ethiopia. And so, we have many countries now who are beginning to understand these impacts and are wanting the tools that they can use.
So in America, is this implement like for all kids in foster care system? And I know the numbers are really down in the States as compared to in Australia. We have big numbers for our population. is this implemented with all children in foster care? Like, is this part of the system? Is it in the system yet?
Not yet in every state. I would say that most people in the United States have access to TBRI and can learn about it, but it's not implemented throughout every system. We have multiple states who are beginning to implement this statewide. So the state of Louisiana, the state of Colorado, the state of Texas, there are states who are taking it very seriously. And as the United States is moving more toward a prevention mindset, TBRI is one of the leading kind of research-based interventions to lead the way in that.
But do you have to have an outreach to these states to say this is a necessary tool? I would think that all kids in foster care, that should be part of the system. I'm a big idealist here, but that should be part of the system that, if you're in foster care, you need this sort of support. And the foster carers need this sort of support also, so that you can ensure a successful experience as they traverse the system.
Yeah. And we work with federal agencies.
Okay.
And so I do believe that will become a norm in the years to come.
Tell me, okay, to get more, can you give me a case study or something, or work that you do, like that you've seen a shift in a child or a shift in a family situation through Karen's work?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's my dog. This happens on every Zoom call.
My dog, I made my son take him for a walk, and I was like, he'll be gone for a long time.
Good move.
Yeah, so I would say that we see TBRI work on the individual level, as well as through organizations and now through systems. And so we can really do like that micro, meso, or macro level intervention with TBRI, and that's the power of it. So for a personal example, we could say, I've worked with families where they have children who really struggle. I think I don't want to say normal, but a fairly common behavior that families see has to do with food, right? Let's say like food hoarding.
That's huge. Yeah.
Yes. And I would say
food hoarding as a behavioral of scarcity.
Yes. Yeah. And so that is a behavior that, to me, we always say in TBRI that behavior is the language of unmet need.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the mindset that we want to take anytime we're talking about a behavior. Isn't how do we change this behavior, but how do we meet the need behind this behavior? Right. What is this?
And how do you get to see what that true need is?
Yes. What is this behavior telling us this child needs?
So what is the food hoarding telling you?
So food hoarding can tell us a couple things. The first is, you already mentioned, felt safety. Right? Does this child feel safe? Do they feel comfortable enough that they know that they will always have food? And a lot of that happens actually in utero. So if a child was hungry in utero, when their brain is developing, that they call it satiation, that satiation part of the brain won't develop correctly. And so this isn't a behavior that we can change for children. It's a behavior that we can help them manage. And so
will that always be there?
So we can teach them ways to understand their bodies and to feel safe so that they don't hoard food. So an example of that might be in TBRI. We might say, like, here are snacks. So like at our house, I have a box of snacks that a child can have at any time, right? And I have one child who has their own box, right? Because the family box that you don't have to ask, you can always have these snacks anytime, right? I will be putting dinner on the table, and I have a teenager who will grab a snack, right? And in my old style of parenting, I would say, put that back, we're eating dinner, right? Yeah. But I know that this child was hungry in utero, and that if I were to say no to him, it wouldn't be about a discipline issue. It would be about, I don't feel safe. Yeah. And so I don't say no to that, right? I might say something like, hey, stick that in your pocket, so when we're done with dinner, you have it, or put that on your plate so that you can eat it with dinner, right? But I'm not going to take that food from him. But he also has a box of snacks that are just his. And when it gets about half full, and he's 15, right? And when it gets about half full, he's like, I need more, right?
I suspect back up.
Yes. And that is that felt safety for him. And I could choose to fight that, but why? Right?
No, but you wouldn't fight it. That's what always got me. Where is the line when you discipline, like the child needs boundaries and disciplines, and where is the line that you have to understand their experience with, which you can't relate to,
right,
organically in yourself, and know how to manage that. That was always the hardest thing for me, to know where to come in hard and where, like, no, this is a different experience here. And knowing, so that's just, I suppose, just with experience and just really knowing your child. But this is what hurts me, is that so many of these kids are misunderstood, and therefore parents unwittingly do the wrong things that increase the bad behavior or increase the lack of safety. That's why I love this work, because the more people that understand it, it's like you get a different narrative, you have a different perspective, and you go, oh, this is what's happening.
Right. And so our kids who have experienced these early relational traumas, one of the things they crave is control, right? Yes. I need to control this situation, not because you're a bad parent, right? Or not because you're a bad caregiver, but because that's what makes me feel safe. And so sometimes when everything else was out of their control, things that should have been in their control, right? Things about like who touches my body, when and where, right? Where I sleep at night, who is my safe person, right? Kids should always have authority or control over those things. And a lot of our kids didn't. And so then things like food become one of the only things they can control, right? And so in TBRI, what we say is like, we share power with kids because that's how we create that felt safety. And so it means we say like, hey, you're always in charge of this box of snacks, and I'll never say no to anything in this box, right? And I'm not going to fill that box with, junk food, right? I'm going to fill that box with things that I feel okay with them eating, but it's a way of giving them an appropriate level of control over their body. Because it's really important that we provide that, like, you're the boss of your body, because that is the foundation of felt safety. And we can't fight that with these kids, or we will literally, bang our heads bloody, because we can't win. They have to be the boss over their body in order for them to feel safe and then heal and attach.
Yeah, attachment. Can you talk more about attachment for people who don't understand that?
Attachment is my favorite subject. So you might have
perfect.
I truly believe that if we as caregivers understand attachment, it will change the trajectory of our society. I really believe that.
That's a big statement. I love that.
And I believe that this is how we change the generational piece to all of this. I would go as far as to say, like, I won't, but I really, truly believe that when we understand attachment, we are laying a really, really healthy foundation. And this is something that should be taught in high school, right? So that,
because we all have different, as parents, we all have different attachment styles as to how we were parented, right? And I remember there's a whole different category. Okay, you tell me.
Yeah. So first of all, like, understanding the attachment cycle is simple. If you think of a circle at the top, you have the child has a need. So let's think of an infant, and they're hungry. And so that child expresses a need. She's 9 months old and she's crying because she's hungry. And then the caregiver comes and that caregiver meets the need and the child calms down, right? And we do that cycle hundreds of thousands of times in the first 2 years of life for our children, right? And every time we complete that cycle with them, we're saying yes, right? Yes, I'll feed you. Yes, I hear you. Yes, I'll come. Yes, I'll rock you. Yes, I'll keep you warm. Yes, I'll keep you company. Yes, you're important. Yes, you matter. Yes, 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 right? And so that is the foundation of trust right there. I can trust. Safe people will meet my needs. It's the foundation for self-worth and self-efficacy, or I have a voice and I matter to the world, right? When I cry, someone comes.
Yeah, which makes me mad, because the old parenting books, which we listened to, said, let your baby cry. Yeah. And that's all been proven wrong. It used to kill me. My husband had to like handcuff me to the bed, because I was told that this was the thing you're supposed to do. And it's wrong.
Same, Deb, same. I literally remember laying in bed and like my entire body telling me to get up and get my baby.
We should listen to ourselves. Yes.
Yes, but we thought we were doing the right thing.
Yes.
We didn't do it. Again, this is why I say there's no parent who went, oh, I can't wait to screw up my kid, right? We all are trying to do the best we can. And usually we're pretty like we take it seriously, right? And I took it seriously. Like I have to let him cry it out. He's 6 weeks old. He needs to learn to self-soothe. All the things the pediatrician told me, which I now know were completely wrong.
And that's for a biological child. For a child that's experienced trauma or abandonment, my gosh, that's just increased.
Exactly. So with that cycle, we're saying, yes, we're laying that foundation. But the other thing that's happening every time that we come, their brains and bodies are literally, they go into like that fight, flight, or freeze, right? Like I'm hungry, it's 2 a.m. And so our brains and bodies release chemicals so that we stay alive, right? And we go into what we call downstairs brain. And then when the caregiver comes, like when we bring the baby to us, when we pat, when we rock, when we sway, all of those things actually release the chemicals in our child's brains and body to calm them down. And so
they learn to regulate. Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of times we've taken their little brains and bodies through what it means to go from hungry to calm, from accidentally bumping their head on the car door to calm, from, right? We've literally laid the foundation for self-regulation and mental health. Their brains and bodies have been walked through that by a caregiver who can coach their brain and body how to do that. This is why when we go, I'm sure this didn't happen at your house, but at my house, a couple times, right? My husband would be sleeping and I'd be up for the 5th time, right? And I'd be like, I can't believe you don't hear this baby, right? And this baby won't calm down. And I would be so upset and the baby wouldn't calm down, right?
Yeah, because they can feel you.
Because
I think we underestimate how attuned. I think we're the most attuned we ever are when we're babies. I think we lose that attunement as we get older with all the stuff that we cover over.
Because we're others regulated as babies, right? That's how we survive as a species. If my caregiver doesn't feel safe and calm, I better not feel safe and calm, right? Because then I don't stay alive.
Well, this is what I've always said in utero, and there's science around this, that, you know, and a lot of mothers who do have to relinquish their child are under enormous stress. So that stress is totally going into that child in utero. So they're arriving already with all the stress hormones and all that stuff happening.
Yep. Tiffany Fields did research on that, and we can match the stress hormones in a mother at 6 months gestation, at 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months post-birth. And the other thing is at birth, we can see changes in their brain. So that's, you know, one of the things we talk about being trauma informed, right? Is that we understand that these stressful experiences that many of us, well, after this past year, all of us, right? We've all had these experiences in some way or another, but we can see changes in their brain at birth. And so that's
immediately after their birth, after they've been born, you see changes in their brain due to the environment?
Due to that mom who is experiencing stress during pregnancy. So at birth, we'll see that they have larger amygdalas. And the amygdala is the part of the brain, we call it like the watchdog of the brain, right? It's the part of the brain.
That's fight or flight, right?
Yep. It controls that fight, flight, or freeze response. So then when we think about as we grow, and you know, you gave the example of a teacher earlier. If my child at birth has a bigger amygdala and all the kids are walking in line at school and he gets bumped, he might turn around and punch somebody, right? Because he went into that fight, flight, or freeze, that downstairs brain. He's not a kid who wants to fight. He's not an aggressive kid.
He's just more sensitized. Yeah.
His brain looks different. And if we
sorry, go on.
Yeah, if we treat that kid like he's an aggressive kid, all research shows us, yep, they'll do just that, right? But if we understand that's a brain difference, not a bad kid, right? It's an I can't, not an I won't.
Yeah.
Right? Those are very different.
Yes.
And we respond to that child in a way that we help them to feel safe, then we're going to grow a kid very, very different than if we assume that child is an aggressive child and therefore we treat them that way.
If you treat someone like that, they're going to behave like that. If you think you're going to win, you probably win. Think you're going to lose? Yeah, that's probably right too. Yep. This always fascinated me too, because, and you say that the actual physical brain is different. Because why is it so many adopted children are diagnosed with ADD, dyslexia, sensory integration issues, and a lot of issues that mimic the autistic spectrum.
Right. Yeah.
So is that because of trauma? They're very different things, but because of trauma affecting the physical body, like you just gave the example, that fight or fright.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So not all of what I'll say is, for example, with sensory integration, we know that the result of those stressful experiences changes the way our body processes sensory input because of the changes in our brain. So sensory input comes into a certain portion of the brain, and that filters, does this go to that amygdala, right? That fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain, or can I filter it into the prefrontal cortex, right? That's a train that you hear far away, or that's the humming of the light, right? And we can kind of make some logical sense out of it. But for children who have experienced those early traumatic and stressful experiences, we see that part of the brain is different. And as a result, we see those sensory processing things. And the
like dyslexia and ADD.
Sensory processing is more around like, so that would.
No, I hear that, but as well as ADD and dyslexia, is that because the brain processes differently?
So a lot of people would say that ADD, if you were to put the symptoms of ADD and ADHD in a circle, and then the symptoms of early trauma, those symptoms are almost the exact same.
Yeah.
So ADD, it should only be diagnosed if the medicine's working. If it's not working, your child doesn't have ADD. They have early childhood trauma that we need to deal with.
Yeah.
So those.
I remember when I was a young adoptive mother, they all got me ready for ADD and this and that. And I'm like, why you talk about, how could you possibly know this?
Right.
And now I understand. Yeah.
And then the sensory piece, which again is a lot of that early stuff where they go, oh, I bet this kid has ADD, right? Because they're jumping around instead of sitting down in the circle, or they're, kicking their feet, or a lot of that comes from, again, that sensory processing and that change in the brain. And so again, those are those behaviors that if we don't have our trauma-informed lens on, we interpret those behaviors as a naughty kid, or a kid with ADD, or a kid with X, Y, or Z. But in reality, that behavior is meeting a need, right? If I need more proprioceptive input than, let's say, I might sit in my chair and bounce so that I get that input. And if that bugs my teacher, right, suddenly I'm a kid who am always bugging my teacher, instead of a kid who's getting their need met. And so again, that lens can really help us to teach kids really and empower kids to get their needs met appropriately.
Because it has such a big effect on their self-confidence, and that is everything. I've always said that this is the biggest thing, is self-esteem. That affects everything. And if a child does not have that self-esteem, it just cripples them in so many areas. So how you look at it is so right. So parents, you need to look at these as not as a fault, but as a challenge, a hurdle that we can overcome.
But also, I love that it can also be a strength.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
I love that. Like for my son, he is one of those kids. For one of my kiddos, we're his seventh home, right? When
Wow. That hurts my heart.
Me too. And him mostly.
How old is he?
He's now 13. But when he came to us, he was 4. And
he had 7 homes when he was 4.
Yeah, he was actually 3 when he came to us, 4 when he was adopted. So 7 homes before the age of 3.
Because he was unhandleable?
Yeah, they would say, he's super hard. Yeah, he's a hard kid. He's my sweetest, best kid. And like Karen would say, right, a lot of times the kids that are the hardest are the most sensitive, the sweetest kids, right? And so they just have so much to protect.
Yes.
So much to protect because their hearts are so big and so tender. But for him, he needs a lot of proprioception, or it's deep muscle input, right? So if I were to tickle his back, he would hate that.
Yeah.
right? But if I give him a massage, that really helps him and calms him down. So that looked like, as a 3-year-old, a kid who would bump into everything, right? He would walk down the hall like this, bumping against the walls. He would smash into kids. He would, because he was trying to say, where am I at in the world?
Wow.
Because he grew up in a car seat, right? Nobody ever held him tight, right?
Wow.
Nobody ever bounced with him or rocked him or swaddled him when he was upset. And so he needed that to feel, where am I at in
Feel
the
alive. I like to feel
yeah.
contact.
Yeah, I'm
Wow.
still here, right? And
Fascinating.
so for us, we learned quickly, okay, here's what he needs. And so we got him a pull-up bar, right? We got him a trampoline. And so I remember the first time he was probably 6. And he, came jumping to me and he said, I need to go jump on the trampoline before school so I make good choices. Right. And I was like, that's an empowered kid, right? That's a kid who knows I'm not a bad kid.
And
I'm
I
a kid.
want to make good choices. Yeah.
Yeah.
As you
And
said, we want to be the best parents, and the kids want to be the best they can be.
absolutely do. I often say, if you have a kid who's failing over and over, you as a parent have to change your bar. That's not on your kid.
Yeah.
Because none of us wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to fail at my job today. Right? I can't wait to fail my spouse or whatever it is, right? We all want to do a good job. And so if we have a kid who's continuously failing, that's for us to say, how can I help to scaffold them, right? How can I support them more? Or how do I lower the bar for them so that they can be successful, so that they can think well of themselves?
It's great. I love the work that you guys do. And as I said, to me, it's the most important, because there's so much healing to be done for these kids. And trauma is a huge, huge issue, not just in the community of abandoned children, for all of us. We've all had trauma on some level. So I think until we recognize it and acknowledge it, we can't move on.
Right.
And so, and I love, just things you're saying are really resonating with me as parents. Like, it's so easy, like, why are they doing that? Or why are they doing it? You have to stop. You have to breathe. You have to have more patience, I think, with a child that's coming from a hard place, because it's not how it is in your world. It's a different world going on. You have to stop and really see the truth of what's there, and give them support. And as you say, make them feel safe. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope we can work together with Hopeland and you guys. And already, you've worked with my organization in Australia with Adopt Change, as in Karen coming over and giving advice. And we'd love to help get the word out about the work that you're doing, and so that more people can access your services, and we can have a much better, safer world for all these kids.
That's right. I actually lived in Caringbah, just south of Sydney, for about a year.
Are you kidding? Did you like it?
Oh my gosh. I have a huge heart for Australia, and just love the people. And so, yeah. And we would love to work with you guys in any way.
Right.
Karen, as she passed, her dying wish, was that we would get TBRI to all of the hurting kids and all of the hurting families in the world. And Dr. Cross kind of would tease her and be like, could we focus on Texas, or how about the United States? And she was like, no, I mean the whole world. And so we've really taken that seriously at the Institute since she passed. And we really are trying to make a global impact for her legacy.
I love that. And she did. I always said she had a heart as big as Texas. And I said the same thing to her as she was passing. I said, you have my word. I will try to continue to spread the word about what you're doing. And, it's still in Australia, a lot of people still work by her stuff. So it's great.
I think she'd be proud of you, Deb.
And you. I think it's amazing. You're on the front line and you're like, I'm terrible. I hear stories and I'm like, it's so hard. I don't know how sometimes you have to keep yourself separate, because I'm sure you hear some heartbreaking scenarios.
Secondary trauma is a real thing, right? We have to really take care of each other.
And you have to protect yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, for caregivers, right? For those of us who are caring for kids who have experienced these traumas, usually we've also experienced trauma as caregivers, right? But even if we haven't, secondary trauma is a real thing. And so taking care of ourselves and meeting our needs, being in healthy relationships is so important.
It's so holistic. Absolutely. How many kids do you have?
I have 5.
All adopted, or?
No, we have 2 biological and 3 adopted through foster care.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
That's a big family.
It is. I was really young. I probably didn't know better. But we have fantastic kids and we have a lot of fun. I will say that we have a lot of fun together. So
Awesome. Awesome.
yeah.